Okay, there we go. Okay. So, two of the things that we mentioned in the Mishnah, that the Beishan can't learn and the Kaptan can't be a teacher. So I want to just spend a moment identifying who is a Beishan, who is a Kaptan. A Beishan is a person who is very self-conscious, a person who is worried that if they're going to ask a question, people are going to think something about them, and they don't have that image of themselves. They don't have a good image of themselves, and therefore they're afraid that whatever image other people have of them is going to be a negative image. The Kaptan, the angry person, the person who's a short-tempered person, the Mishna translates it as an impatient person. But the reason that a person is impatient is because he has a certain vision of himself, and he feels that you're taking away from that, that your questions are taking away from who he is. Your questions are challenging who he is, what he stands for, as opposed to looking at you and seeing that you have a difficulty or you have something that's bothering you. He takes it very personally and he sees it on himself. The Kaptan is a person who is not far away from gaiva, not far away from haughtiness, and from a overinflated sense of self. And what I want to speak about this morning is that in truth, there is no difference between a Kaptan and a person who is a Beishan. That there is no difference between somebody who is a haughty person and somebody who is a person with very low self-esteem. They're actually the same. I want to show this in a very, very dramatic and beautiful way. I do want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to do this faster than I normally would. But there's a famous story in the Gemara. The story in the Gemara is the story of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza. Everybody knows the story of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza. That towards the end of the time of Yerushalayim, there was a very rich man who made a party, and he invited his he had a friend that was named Kamtza. He had an enemy that was named Bar Kamtza. He invited his friend Kamtza to the party, and instead of inviting his friend, his servant went and brought Bar Kamtza to the party, the person who was his enemy. He walks into the party, he sees his enemy Bar Kamtza there, and he says, "Get out." So the fellow says, "Look, do me a favor, let me at least pay for my food." And he says, "No, get out." He says, "Look, don't embarrass me in front of the entire Jerusalem. Every rabbi that was anybody was there at that party." He says, "Do me a favor, every person that's here in Yerushalayim, don't throw me out of the party." So he says, "No, get out of here." He says, "I'll pay for the half party." He says, "No." He says, "I'll pay for the entire party." And the fellow says, "No," and he throws him out of the party. This Bar Kamtza now becomes so upset that he decides that he is going to get this fellow and all the people of Yerushalayim, he's going to get them back. And he goes to the Romans and he says to them, "Mardabach Yudai, the Jews are rebelling against you." The Romans say they couldn't be rebelling against us. We get along beautifully with the Jews. So he said, "I'll prove it to you. Send a sacrifice to the temple and the Jews are not going to sacrifice your sacrifice." And that's because they're rebelling against you. So they send the sacrifice. In halacha, you are allowed to send a sacrifice. You're allowed to sacrifice a non-Jew sacrifice. There's no issues. What he did was, as he was carrying the sacrifice to the temple, is he put a little nick in the lip of the sacrifice, which is called a mum, a blemish, which makes it unsacrificable on the temple. They bring it up to the Beis Hamikdash. There is a sage who is in charge of the rabbis on the top of the temple in the chamber of hewn stone, and his name is Shimon of Kulis, and he was a wonderful person, but he had a dilemma. And he couldn't decide whether he was going to sacrifice or not sacrifice the sacrifice, because he was worried that if he sacrificed the sacrifice with a blemish, then all Jews are going to say, it doesn't matter whether you have a blemish or not, you can bring it up to the temple. If he wouldn't sacrifice the sacrifice, then he's going to say that they're going to look at us in a negative way, and we're going to have problems. And they sat and deliberated back and forth. They thought for a moment that they would go and take Bar Kamtza to the back of the temple, and they would kill him. And this way, just make his body disappear. And I don't know what happened to Bar Kamtza, and get away around the problem that way. But they couldn't make up their mind. And because they couldn't make up their mind, they ended up not sacrificing the sacrifice. The Romans interpreted that as a rebellion, and they went and destroyed Jerusalem. The Talmud says that Jerusalem was destroyed because of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza. The Talmud then says that Jerusalem was destroyed because of this Rabbi Shmuel ben Avkulis. He caused the destruction of the temple. So question number one is, who caused the destruction of the temple? Was it Kamtza and Bar Kamtza that caused the destruction of the temple? Or was it this Rabbi Shmuel ben Avkulis that caused the destruction of the temple? My second problem with this story is that every year on Tisha B'Av, we tell the story of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza. Poor Kamtza. Kamtza was never at the party. He never got an invitation. He wasn't at the party. What did he have to do with the destruction of Jerusalem? The guy who threw the party and took Bar Kamtza and threw him out of the party, that guy's off scot-free. Really, the Talmud should say that that Jerusalem got destroyed because of the fellow that threw the party and Bar Kamtza. They were the antagonists to each other. They were the ones who caused the destruction of Jerusalem. Why are we blaming Kamtza for having destroyed the temple? There are many. Why didn't the rabbi say anything? Why did the guy throw him out? There are many, many questions. I want to just focus on one incredible thing. Kamtza might not have been the man's name. It could have been Harry and Bob. But the Talmud calls him Kamtza, and he calls the other guy Bar Kamtza. Bar means outside of. Kamtza is a kamtzan, a person with a tight fist, a person who is a pathological miser. Bar Kamtza, somebody who was outside of that. The man who threw the party, who was his best friend? The Kamtza. We say birds of a feather flock together. Clearly that he wouldn't take money from the fellow and he threw him out of the party. He wouldn't take half the party. He wouldn't take the money for the whole party. He was also a kamtzan. What is a kamtzan? In psychological terms, in pathological terms, a kamtzan, a person who can't fagin himself to spend some money on himself, has no sense of himself. And therefore he looks at himself as unworthy to take his money and to use his money on himself. He is unworthy for that pleasure. He's unworthy to do that to himself and to take care of himself on that level. A kamtza, a person who is a pathological miserly person, is a person with a low sense of self. The reason why the rabbis didn't say a word to this fellow whose party it was, who had a sense of low self-esteem, is because they knew that to give tochacha to a person, to rebuke a person, you have to love that person. This person didn't love himself. He could not fathom that anybody would love him. And therefore they never would have accepted the tochacha, the rebuke of the rabbis, because this fellow was not in a position to be able to listen to the rebuke of the rabbis, because he didn't trust that it was coming from a place that they were interested in his growth and interested in what was best for him. He didn't believe in himself, and therefore he didn't believe that anybody else believed in him. Bar Kamtza was outside of this. Bar Kamtza had a very healthy vision of himself when he walked into the party. But when he saw every single person in Jerusalem laughing at him, he saw every single person in Jerusalem sitting quietly when he got thrown out of the party, his self-image was destroyed. And therefore, he went to the Romans and said, the Jews are rebelling against you, without thinking. Buddy, do you understand? This means that your mom is going down, and your sister's going down, and your aunt and your uncle are going down. Anybody who you love that lives in Jerusalem is also going to be destroyed. But when you have no sense of self, you have no sense of anyone else around you. When you feel that you have little esteem, you have little worth and value, everybody else around you also has little worth and value. We can see this, by the way. It's not something I'm inventing. It's not, again, it's not a good vart. When you look inside of the Gemara says the conversation between this fellow who threw the party and Bar Kamtza went as follows. The fellow saw Bar Kamtza there, and the Talmud says the following words. The fellow said, Mechti, let's see. Now, who gavra, bal davavada, who gavra? I'm quoting the Gemara in Gittin. That man is an enemy of that man. He was speaking in third person about himself. What the Talmud was telling us is that I don't know what this conversation is. I wasn't there. I don't care what the conversation was. I can tell you, though, what the kind of conversation was. This fellow was talking about himself in third party, in third person. He was disconnected from himself. The Talmud wants us to understand that this person had no sense of self. Then the Talmud tells us that up on the top of the temple, Shmuel ben Avkulis can't decide. He has no idea, should I offer this, should I not offer this? Buddy, you're the leader of Jerusalem. You don't have the rights to be equivocal. You can't sit there and say, I don't know this, I don't know, should I do this, should I not do this? You're a leader. A leader must be decisive. A leader must believe in himself and believe in his cause and believe in what he's doing. But if you don't believe in yourself, you cannot be a leader. And that was what Rabbi Shmuel ben Avkulis was stuck with. He suffered from an inability to feel a sense of self, because if he had a good image of himself, he would have said, this, gentleman, is what we need to do. He would have put his foot down and he would have said, in this situation, this is what is required. But he couldn't make that decision because he had no sense of self. When the Talmud tells me that Yishmael ben Avkulis caused the destruction of the temple, and when the Talmud tells me that Kamtza and Bar Kamtza caused the destruction of the temple, what the Talmud is telling me is that a lack of self-esteem brought down the temple. A lack of a vision of self, a lack of a feeling of self-worth and value, that's what destroyed the temple. That's what causes sinas chinam. I can't get along with you because I can't get along with me, because I feel that you're my competition. You're taking away part of my world. If you succeed, I'm losing because I don't have a comfortable, good picture of myself. As we described yesterday, that's exactly what the Mishna is telling me. Lo hakav Beishan Learn, a person who doesn't have a sense of self is not going to be able to learn, because he's not going to be able to put himself out there. He's not going to be able to break beyond his boundaries, to put himself out there, to be able to belittle himself, to be able to learn that knowledge, to be able to understand those ideas. Ve'lo hakaptan, a person who is an angry person, a makbid person, a person who's got an overinflated sense of self. What is an overinflated sense of self? Lack of sense of self. You know, a person can come across as being a very, very self-assured person, walks into the room and says, oh, you're so vain, you think this song is about you, right? Walks into the room and says, this whole thing is about me. And that is an overinflated sense of self, which means that he has no sense of self. Ultimately has no sense of self-esteem, and it's suffering from the same problem. A person who's marbe b'schayra doesn't understand the way the world works. He doesn't understand. He has no sensitivity to the way the world works. All he knows is that you take this pile and you sell it to that person. You take that pile and you buy it from that person. You buy, you sell. There's no creativity. There's no understanding. There's no depth to understanding. He's, again, living his life on the surface and doesn't see himself in the center of life. That's what schayra is. Schayra is just moving things around. It's just operating. It's not creating. It's not making anything. It's not really doing anything with yourself. It's not really understanding you and who you are. All you're doing is just moving stuff around. That's what it means by schayra. It's not putting down any kind of business. It's talking about a type of person that does business this way, very superficial existence in the world, because he's not connected to the world, because he's not connected to himself. And finally, the Mishnah tells us, where there aren't people, you need to feel like a person. Even though you're humble, even though you feel small, but you need to look around and you need to say, you know what? I'm an epis. I have something to give. I have something to be able to accomplish, and push yourself beyond your limitations and accomplish something. Get a grip of who you are. And I feel that that's what this mission is teaching us. This mission is teaching us that you need to know and be aware of who you are. If you're going to make decisions in your life, if you're going to accomplish anything in your life, if you're going to move anything in your life, you have to be aware of yourself, and you have to know who you are. You have to know your strengths. You have to know what you are. You know, very often we're worried, and we'll talk about this in other Mishnayos, but we're very worried about talking about our strengths, because we feel that it's not humble. That's not a lack of humility. A lack of humility is when I say that I have this strength and therefore I'm better than others. That's a lack of humility. But to recognize what your strength is, that's just understanding who you are, having a good sense of self. I know who I am, and I know that I live inside of a very, very big world. And in essence, I'm very small. However, I'm this flavor small. I'm this color small. This is my smallness. This is who I am. I have an identity. It might be small. It might be relatively insignificant, but nevertheless, this is my identity. In a few Mishnayos, we're actually going to spend a lot of time on this idea in a very beautiful way. But nevertheless, this is what the Mishnah is laying down to us. The Mishnah is saying you need to know who you are. You need to have a good sense of self. Okay. That's what I wanted to share. I think the Mishnah is a packed Mishnah. It's got a lot to say to us. And now what I'd like to do is to have a little opportunity just to schmooze a little bit in the sense of, questions. And it could be on the Mishnayos. It could be on this Mishnah. Comments you want to make and questions you have.
Rabbi Jeff, my suggestion is we concentrate on Yom Yerushalayim.
Okay.
That's my personal preference.
Okay.
The floor is open to other suggestions.
Okay, if anybody, I'll take a few questions, then I'll say something about Yerushalayim.
Okay.
Rabbi, good morning. Thank you.
Good morning.
It was very deep today, as always. You say a few things before about how do you have to behave, but the problem is, in this society, most of the people do not behave that way. Okay, so it's very difficult to cope where if you are very righteous and you go the right way, but people, for example, talk behind your back and they do many other things that harm you, because at the end of the day harms you, how you deal with it.
Okay, tremendous question. That we have, we're learning all of our obligations here in Pirkei Avos and learning about how to be a human being and how to be a mensch, but the world is not necessarily operating on those rules. And how do you operate inside of a world that's living in a different set of rules than the rules that are being taught to us of the proper way of behavior? So I'm going to tell you two very important things. We've touched on it a little bit, and we will continue to touch on this often. My obligations in life have nothing to do with whether you're fulfilling yours or not. My obligations to be a mensch, my obligations to be a good human being, have nothing to do with whether you're living up to that or not. Now, if we have a relationship, you're not living up to that. We have a business relationship. I'm trying to be honest. You're being shifty and sneaky. So then I have to protect myself. Yaakov Avinu, the most honest person in the world, he was dealing with a couple of used car salesmen, and he had to deal in a very, very careful kind of way. He had to deal with them in the way that they dealt. Yaakov Avinu got the bracha dressed up like in a Purim costume. And why? Because Yaakov Avinu realized, his mother really realized, that the only way for him to succeed is in this moment to be able to act that way. But that didn't take away his obligation from being an honest person. Sometimes practically you have to deal in a certain way, but that can't change who you are. It can't change your character. Sometimes, again, the way you act has to be commensurate with that kind of situation. Look, let's talk about anger. That we're going to learn more about it later in the chapter. But anger is something the Torah tells us that we're not allowed to get angry. Our rabbis talk about anger in such a way that is incredible. But sometimes, especially like you're a teacher or a parent, if you don't show your child a little bit of anger, so then the child thinks that they can get away with everything, and it's not good for them. So how do you balance the two? That I'm never supposed to get angry, but my child needs to see a little bit of that. They need to bounce up against this wall, and they need to know that there are parameters, there are edges. So the Rambam talks about how a teacher is allowed to show anger. There's a difference between showing anger and being angry. I'm using this thing called anger in order to be able to deal with my situation, but I'm not necessarily angry. So I'm dealing with you. You're a person who's a dishonest person. You're a person I can't trust. So I deal with you in a way that's a little bit slimier than I normally would act, only because I'm trying to protect myself, making sure that I don't get hurt here. But I'm careful not to let it change my character, not to let it change who I am. It's just what I'm doing, but not who I am. And that's the way we operate in a world that doesn't live according to our rules. We operate in that world. It doesn't make a difference. We still operate. We still are the way we are and who we need to be, irrespective of what we're getting back from the other side. Okay.
All right.
That's my thought.
I have a question also.
Sure.
It's a question that's involved me for a while in the words. It says "V'lo kol hamarbe schora." It says "V'lo kol hamarbe schora." What's the word? Machkim, right?
Right.
So why does it say "V'lo kol hamarbe"? Why does it just say "V'lo hamarbe b'schora machkim"? Because it always says, it doesn't say "Lo kol Beishan Learn." It says "Beishan Learn." Why
Right.
does it use a kol?
Because a Beishan inherently is a bad midah. It's inherently something wrong. But schira, there's nothing wrong with that. There are times in our lives where we operate on a superficial level. We have to. Whatever the situation calls for us, just to not get too involved and just to deal with it on a superficial level. But kol hamarbe But anybody who's marbe b'schayra, not everybody who's marbe b'schayra is going to machim. Some will, but not everybody's going to be able to do it. Because if you're marbe b'schayra, you're going to get sucked into that kind of way of thinking, that superficial way of thinking of life, that disconnected kind of way, dispassionate, disconnected kind of way of thinking, that everything's about numbers and everything's about business, everything's about, moving it around, but it's not about creating, it's not about making, it's not about something of deep meaning. Some people can live their lives that way and can find meaning in other things. Other people get sucked into it, and that's why it says lo kol hamarbe. Not every person that is marbe b'schayra is going to end up this way, is going to be able to make it through and to be able to be machkim. That's the way I see it.
Thanks. That makes sense.
Okay, so we'll say a quick word about Yerushalayim. I always go back to the same place in Yerushalayim, to the same idea of Yerushalayim, the idea that I mentioned in the very, very beginning of Pirkei Avos, which was that Yerushalayim is Ir Shechu B'Lo Yachtov. There's a city that draws everybody together. When we on Yom Yerushalayim, we focus on the miracle, and the miracle that we're focusing on is the miracle, and that the city of Jerusalem is back in our hands. To whatever extent that means, but that the city of Jerusalem is back in our hands, we can go down by the Kaisel. But now you need to stop and think for a second. What that means is that the city of Jerusalem is in our hands. The Makom HaMikdash is something that is tangible to us, not in our hands though. We don't yet have it in our hands, but it's tangible to us. It's something we can see, we can look at, we can view. But really, ultimately, all that means that the place of the Churban, the place of the destruction, is in our hands. Because when we look at Yerushalayim and we see the golden yarmulke sitting on top of the place where the Beis Hamikdash once stood, then that only causes us more pain, not less pain. It's like now I can stand at the place which is the remnant of the Churban, the remnant of the destruction, and I can look at it and go, great. Now the broken pieces, I can hold on to the broken pieces. It's a great day of celebration, but it's a day that has to remind us that there is something that is incomplete. How do you deal with that incompletion, with that sense of incompletion, that sense of that, at a wedding we break a glass, and one of the reasons that we break a glass is to remind us of the Churban Beis Hamikdash. Here we are at the highest moment of our joy, and we put a little ash on the head of the head of the chassan to remind us of the ashes of the Beis Hamikdash. We stand there and we remember the destruction of the temple. What does that do for us? So I want to tell you a very important thing. The Gemara in Makkas talks about Rabbi Akiva and his colleagues standing on Har HaTzofim looking over the Temple Mount. Rabbi Akiva laughs and his colleagues cry. His colleagues turn to Rabbi Akiva and say, "Why are you laughing?" Rabbi Akiva says, "Why are you crying?" In other words, it was as if it was valid to cry, but it was invalid to laugh. Rabbi Akiva says it's invalid to cry. They said, "Why are we crying?" He said, "Because a place where it says that a foreigner, a stranger, a person who's not a Kohen that goes in is going to die, the Zara Karav Yumas, and now we're looking at foxes going in and out of the Temple Mount, and we shouldn't cry?" So Rabbi Akiva says, that's exactly why I'm laughing. Because I'm looking at that, and I know that there are two prophecies. The one prophecy is that Zion will be plowed under like a field. And the other prophecy is that Od Yeshvu, in the future, there is going to sit in the streets of Jerusalem, elders and children laughing and singing and rejoicing in the streets of Jerusalem. Until I saw the first prophecy come true, how did I know that the second prophecy was going to come true? But now that I see the first prophecy, that Zion is plowed under like a field, I see that come true. Now I know the second prophecy is going to come true. Od Yeshu's Kingdom Nekevos. The rabbis turn to him and say, Akiva nichamtanu, Akiva nichamtanu. Akiva, you've comforted us. Akiva, you've comforted us. How did he comfort them? The temple still wasn't built. The temple still wasn't, it didn't do anything for the temple. It's still a destroyed place. There are foxes running in and out of the Holy of Holies. It's still a ruin. It's still plowed under like a field. It didn't change anything. So what do you mean, Akiva nichamtanu? You comforted us. What was the comfort that he gave to them? What is the word nechama? What is a comfort? That is a good discussion for another time. But the word comfort is not what we think it is. When we go to do Nichum Avelim, we think that the Nichum Avelim is that we're going to sit in front of the mourner and we're going to say a smart word to them and we're going to make them feel better. And that's not the Nichum Avelim. The Nichum Avelim is allowing them to get a different perspective. We'll discuss this in a time, but when we let them talk about the Niftar or the Niftaris, we let them talk about the one who's passed, and they talk about them, and they describe them, and they speak about them. So then at the end of Shiva, they get a completely different perspective. They walked in with one perspective, and by talking about that person, the shape, the person takes a brand new shape, takes on a totally different life and a different shape and vision to them. That's what a nechama is. A nechama is a new perspective. Akiva nichamtanu, they said to Rabbi Akiva, you've given us a new perspective. What was their perspective? When they looked at a destroyed building, what did they see? A destroyed building. Is that valid? Sure. What is a destroyed building? It's a destroyed building. But when Rabbi Akiva looked at a destroyed building, what did he see? He saw building. He saw future. He saw that the destruction was the beginning of the rebuilding, that the tragedy was the beginning of the joy. It wasn't that this was one event and that's going to be another event. This event will give rise to that event. The destruction is itself part of the building. It's the Yerida L'Tzarech Aliyah. It's the going down in order to be able to go up. It's the destruction in order to be able to build. When Rabbi Akiva saw the destroyed places of Jerusalem, he didn't see destroyed places of Jerusalem. He saw the beginning of rebuilding. Akiva nichamtanu, Akiva, you've given us a new perspective. That's what Yom Yerushalayim has to leave us. It's not, wow, look what happened in 67. We got Israel back. That's not what's meant to be on Yom Yerushalayim. We're meant to say, look, we got it back, but it's still a destroyed place. But look out at it. What do you see? Do you see destruction? Or do you see the buildings of rebuilding? Do you see the beginning of a rebirth, of a rebuilding? You see, even though you're looking at a golden yarmulke, you're looking at somebody else's religion, you're looking at somebody else's stronghold on the mountain, but their stronghold is in order to ensure that ours is going to be everlasting, that ours is going to be even stronger and even longer than that. And for ours is going to be for eternity. When I look at that, when I look, Moshe, at the kotel behind where you are, I'm not looking at a destroyed place, at a last remnant of a temple. I'm looking at the first remnant of the first foundation of the building of the next temple. And that's the perspective that we have to have. Yerushalayim in our hands means that that's the beginning now of the next stage. It's the beginning of the building of Yerushalayim, of the everlasting building of Yerushalayim. And that's the simcha of Yom Yerushalayim. The simcha of Yom Yerushalayim is that we can look at this and we can see already the rebuilding. I remember once I saw a beautiful video of a kid that goes out of his, and he wakes up on Yom Yerushalayim. It was an Israeli video. Kid wakes up, and you see him, he goes to daven, and then he's walking in the street, and then you see him looking, and he's looking at the Temple Mount, and you see the Beis Hamikdash there, and you see the cloud and all the things that we would see when the Beis Hamikdash is built, and then it pans out, and it's not the Beis Hamikdash, it's only a model of the Beis Hamikdash, and it's still the way it is. But that's the way our eyes have to be. When we look at that place, we have to see not what was, but we have to see what that represents, what is. And what is this is the beginning of the Kedusha, the beginning of the rebuilding, the beginning of the Binyan Beis Hamikdash, and the beginning of the building of the everlasting temple for God and for the Jewish people. That's my thought on Yom Yerushalayim.
Rob. I'm just going to post something to the group. It's thoughts of Rav Kook concerning Yom Yerushalayim, specifically the difference between Jerusalem and Zion. It's beautiful prose and it's beautiful thoughts. So I'll be posting that to the group today sometime.
Okay, awesome. I wish everyone a beautiful Yom Yerushalayim, a beautiful day, an amazing Shabbos. And Mirz Hashem, next week is the Shavua Shechalbai. It's the week that Kabbalah Satorah happens in. And we will talk about Kabbalah Satorah and why Shavuos is not the holiday of the cheesecake. Why it is actually something of incredible importance and can actually change a person's year. It's like a Rosh Hashanah in certain aspects, and we will talk about that. And by the way, I'll just give you a little, I'll just drop a little bomb. There are 2 times a year where we read the Tochacha, we read curses, and then we have a week separating between the curses and the festival. We do it before Shavuos, and we do it before Rosh Hashanah. Those are the 2 curses in the Torah, Parshas Bechukosai, which is 2 weeks before Shavuos, and then Parshas Kisavo, which is usually 2 weeks before Rosh Hashanah. And our rabbis tell us, Shetich Lashana V'Kilasa, that the year should end with its curse. In other words, the curse goes, and now the year begins. Now, I understand that for Rosh Hashanah, certainly. But what does that mean by Shavuos? The year is not ending. We're smack in the middle of the year. No matter where you started, we're either towards the end or we're getting towards the middle. But wherever it is, we're in the year. We're not starting a new year. So what exactly does that mean? That the year should end and the curse should be behind us? What does it have to do with Shavuos? Okay. Have a wonderful, wonderful day, wonderful Shabbos, and Amir Hashem Sunday morning, 8:45. We will see you all again.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Okay.
Thank you.
Wonderful day.